Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this video I'm going to be talking about my 4-step process for creating a decent RPG villain. So, step 1, make the player characters really hate your villain and want to take them down. Step 2, don't have them appear straight away or overuse them. Step 3, give your villain goals and achievable aims. And finally, as with a lot of these things, get player feedback. I cannot stress how important that is. Okay, so let's look at step 1 first, which is going out of your way to make the villain hated and disliked by the players. The more your players find themselves opposed by the villain, the more they are repulsed and dismayed by his actions, and the more the actions affect them, the more they will hate that villain, the more they will dislike that villain, the more they will want to take them down and achieve some measure of retribution or justice, depending on what sort of player party you're running with. One of the best ways to make players hate a villain is to threaten what the player characters hold dear. Now, this may include other PCs, places, to use Old World of Darkness parlance. If they have a haven or something similar, you could threaten that. NPCs, whether it be contacts, allies, or just other random NPCs that they're particularly fond of. And finally, their items, property, or reputation. These always seem to hit home well because in a lot of systems, these are tangible things that player characters have won with their own actions. They've earned these things with their own hands. And you don't have to take them away from them, but the threat that the villain could take them away will really hit home to the player characters and will really make them dislike this villain and want to take them down. Step 2, don't have your villain appear straight away or overuse them. You don't want the villain to just come in the first session and either be so powerful that they just wipe the floor with your player characters, but nor do you want them to come in the first session and have the player characters just wipe the floor with them. That way results in no tension, no build up to a great confrontation. What you want to do is start off gradually and have the player characters build up to a final confrontation with the villain, ratcheting up the tension as you go along. One way to do this is to foreshadow the villain long before they appear in your game. Have the PCs come across evidence of how your villain's actions have affected others in a negative way, or in a way that the player characters would disapprove of. Then slowly, as time progresses and they start to come across more and more evidence of this villainy, have the actions start to impinge on the PC's lives, on the periphery of their lives. Whether this is threatening what they held dear, as discussed in the first point, or some other way, as long as it starts to slightly impede the player characters in some way. Once the player characters inevitably push back, which is a natural reaction when you're being challenged, they will appear as a little blip on the villain's radar, although normally a minor inconvenience at first, and the villain may spare some scant resources in order to try and deal with this minor irritation. Now, as I say, there will be a minor irritation at first, so the villain's unlikely to appear directly. Most villains have minions or henchmen that they will dispatch to deal with people or problems that they consider to be beneath them. This is great for you as a GM, since it allows your villain to be more powerful than the player characters at the start, and for them to clash with his forces without just being wiped out of the game by the villain directly. It also allows the PCs to advance to get nearer the villain's power level, facing tougher and more difficult to defeat minions as they become more and more troublesome to the villain of your piece, until inevitably they will have that final confrontation with the main villain himself. Now, it's very important in this situation that you make your villain difficult and challenging, but not impossible to beat. You're looking to get your players invested and putting their energy into defeating this villain. If it is obvious from the start that there is absolutely no hope of defeating this villain, then the player characters will lose interest. They won't invest in it, since there's no point in striving for this goal if it really can't be achieved, unless that's the theme of your game and you've made that clear from the start, but that's beyond the scope of this video. But even if it's the slimmest of hopes, then the player characters, once you've got them really hooked and they're really wanting to take down this bad guy, they will spare no expense. They will make any sacrifice in order to take their revenge, revisit retribution, or achieve justice in this situation. But you should never make them impossible to beat. You may make a villain look impossible to beat, but if you're going for a Sauron from Lord of the Rings style villain who seems almost invincible, you need to give them some sort of weakness that a clever group of player characters can find out and use against them. The next point is to give your villain achievable goals and aims, and not to make them seem cartoonish or one-dimensional. Generally, in real life, people don't set out to be evil. Villains rarely think of themselves as the bad guy. Normally, people are judged to be bad or evil because they have motivations or values that conflict with the rest of society or that are harmful to the rest of society. And this should certainly be the case with your villains. They have goals and aims which cause the mainstay of society to regard them as villainous, but they will rarely themselves think, oh yes, I'm just the bad guy. And the more realistic their goals are, the more realistic their aims are. Hell, perhaps the player characters can even sympathize with their plight to some degree, but the method they go about pursuing it is what puts them at odds with the player characters. For instance, let's say your villain is the disinherited heir of a kingdom who was wrongfully cast out into exile before they could assume the throne. Your player characters might be full of sympathy for this person and how they were wronged, but what if this person turns to the dark path to reclaim their throne? What if they raise an army of monstrous creatures and wage war upon the kingdom using their army and forbidden sorceries in order to seize back the throne which they believe was rightfully theirs? No matter how much the player characters sympathize with their plight, they're surely not going to stand by and let them carry out their aims using those means. If the goals of your villain stand in opposition to the player character's overall goals, so much the better, since it gives them a more direct reason for opposing them. And if one or more of the PCs has a particular antagonist in their background, consider making this the villain of your campaign or your session. If you can fold in more than one player's background, great. Since the players already have a reason to dislike this villain built into their background, then all you have to do is build upon this foundation, making them more hated and more villainous, and building up to that final confrontation, as we discussed at the start of this video. Now, the final step, as with a lot of these videos I do, and I can't overstate how important it is to get player input. Each time your villain or his influence is felt, ask the player characters what they think is going on and solicit feedback from your players about the villain. This is important for a number of reasons. One, it lets you know how good a job you're doing, whether the player characters are really invested in defeating this villain. Plus, the player characters may mention some things you haven't thought of that you can fold into how you play the villain. giving the players more input and more creative control over the session, which can only be a good thing for getting them invested in the game. So that's my 4-stage process for creating an RPG villain. I hope you've enjoyed the video and that you'll consider clicking on like down below and subscribing to the Red Dice Diaries channel. If you have any comments, please hit me up in the Google Plus links. Maybe you've got some further suggestions for what makes a great villain in an RPG campaign. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter. Thank you very much for watching and for listening, and I will see you next time.